Love is like fireworks, brilliant yet fleeting. But the shadow of betrayal may forever cast a pall over the soul. The life of Alex Thompson. From the sweet first love in high school to the complex emotions of adulthood. Every step is thrilling and heart-stopping. When love encounters betrayal. Should you choose to forgive or to sever ties? Alex's story takes you on a journey to the brink of love and pain. Want to know what happens next? Be sure to follow our channel for more. I'm sitting on the sofa, looking into the soothing glow of the fireplace with a glass of eggnog in my hand. It's Christmas Eve, and I can hear my wife humming a carol in sync with the calm music playing on the stereo as she sets out the Santa Claus gifts. Even though our children are almost grown, we still have Santa on Christmas morning. But instead of dolls and toys, the gifts are sweaters and gowns, movies and CDs. They are offered with the same care that they have grown to expect from us. I look across at her, and as is so common, she looks back at the same time our eyes meet. And we exchange a smile full of eternal love. I recall an earlier Christmas Eve many years ago, as well as one 2 years prior when a series of sad events led Lily to become my girlfriend and shortly after, my wife. They say that sometimes you have to pass through hell to get to heaven. And this was true in my circumstance. I went through suffering that I would never wish on any man. Yet without it I would not have Lily. I wouldn't be half the man I am now. Allow me to give you my story, as it has some valuable lessons. To the best of my knowledge, there has only ever been one flawless guy. And he was far more than simply a man, so it goes to reason that at some point in our lives, we have all done something wrong, something that has caused someone else pain. We've all done things that should have resulted in our condemnation, at least from the higher powers. And it is because of mercy that we are spared the consequences of our frequently dumb decisions. In my instance, I took someone who was straight, or at least drug-free, and set her on a route to addiction. Dylan was introduced to marijuana when we were barely out of high school. And as a result of that one polluting moment, she gradually slid into the world of junkies and prostitution. It might not have been so horrible if I hadn't gotten her pregnant shortly afterward. We married, and she gave me 3 children over the course of 4 years, 2 daughters and 1 boy. It wasn't until we'd been married nearly 8 years that I knew who she had become behind my back and beneath my nose. And it took the majority of my money and all of my self-esteem before I was ultimately free from her. Even then, she left me with physical and emotional scars that I still bear to this day. My name is Alex Thompson, and I am 42 years old, lot wiser than I was at 15. I was born and reared in a suburb near a medium-sized southern metropolis. My parents were very well off, and I tried my hardest to appear cool. Even though I was on the football team throughout high school, I didn't play much, primarily on special teams and junior varsity. That never prevented me from smoking cigarettes, drinking beer or smoking marijuana. That's how things were back then. You'd think that when a dear buddy of mine was killed during my senior year of high school, some of us would have learned our lesson. In my situation it worked for a time. I was recovering from that incident when I started dating AZ. We attended a class together, and she identified me as someone in need. Never mind that she already had a boyfriend who was a year older and attended a nearby junior college. We began dating, and she soon brought him over for me. That should have served as a warning. But I was so caught up in love that I missed it. Rebecca was a touch taller than typical and fairly attractive, with a figure that had all of the components in the appropriate places and proportions. She was always self-conscious about her nose, which had a slight crook to it. But it did not detract from her beauty. She had soft brown hair that was completely unnoticeable. She was mostly a sweet girl, the youngest child of a truck driver and a school teacher. But there were a few people who didn't like her, one of whom being my father. Even before she got involved with drugs, Rebecca was temperamental at times, and she could be a bit much. That was fine because when I was in a bad mood, I could be rather filthy. Even my mother, who liked and empathized with her, saw the dangers of 2 people like us hooking up. I also believe my father sensed that devils were lurking in her psyche, ready to consume me if unleashed furthermore. He believed I could do a lot better. But I was in love in addition. He was said to have married beneath his position. My mother turned out to be a real princess. The relationship could have ended if I hadn't gone to college and returned for Thanksgiving break with a newfound passion for the pleasures of marijuana. My first day back from college was a Tuesday morning. Alisa's parents were working. So she met me at the door, still clad in her skimpy nightgown. We hadn't been together in a few months, and we were both hot and horny. But I persuaded her to put on some clothes and ride with me. We had a great, fantastic parking location that we had used before. So I drove us there. We parked, and I took out a fat doobie. She gave me a disapproving look, but I assumed she'd always been intrigued about it, given how I talked about it in indirect words. So she agreed to try it. She began to laugh a lot. Then she turned on me with a fervor I'd never seen in her before. We had intercourse previously, but she always seemed to be holding something back. Not this time. She kissed me fervently, and within seconds, we were furiously ripping at each other's clothes. Having sex in the backseat of a car is not the most comfortable experience, but it was certainly exhilarating. We were drenched in sweat and giggling uncontrollably as we gently floated back to earth after such an unbelievable high. I suddenly realized that we'd had the same impact on Rebecca as we did on me. It made her extremely hot, and we had sex every chance we got that weekend until I left on Sunday. We spent the entire Christmas vacation doing basically the same thing. However, finding the time and space to have sex might be challenging. It was not all fun and games. And the more the Christmas break lasted, the more tension there was. Rebecca was so horny and fell so quickly into the weed that I would later wonder what she was doing while I was away at college. When we weren't getting stoned and having sex, we were getting a little at each other. And I believe we were on the verge of breaking up when fate intervened. I'd been back at college for almost a month when Rebecca called, blubbering her period had been late. She had gone silently to the clinic, and the doctor verified her greatest fears: she was pregnant. Despite the fact that neither of us were particularly devout, we did not believe in abortion. After discussing it, we decided to marry. Needless to say, both sets of parents were unhappy, and my father, in particular, implored me not to go ahead with it. But I believed it was the manly and honest thing to do. So in May 1983 we got married much later, following the birth of our daughter Mary. I calculated the time frame, and Rebecca must have conceived on or around Christmas Day. I'd do the same thing with the other two, with a wife and children to support. College was not an option, so I took a job as a stocker and cashier at a drugstore. I couldn't have landed that job under the same conditions today because I wouldn't have passed a drug test. But it wasn't usual procedure back then. I quickly developed a liking for the job. After 2 years, I was promoted to assistant store manager at another location in town. And in 1985 Rebecca gave me a son named Robert. Just a year later we had our second daughter, Allison. Rebecca had her tubes closed, and we went about raising our family. Throughout this time we split quite amicably, but nothing too wild. We smoked pot on a regular basis and occasionally indulged in coke, hash or LSD. Rebecca enjoyed how some of the medicines made her feel, and she was passionate about it when we were high. We had sex like rabbits. However, as the children grew older, the stronger drugs became less appealing to me, and as I took on greater responsibility, I allowed it to evaporate from my life. I assumed Rebecca had as well. Let me add that I adored her throughout this. Even when things got a little tense around the house, Rebecca chose to return to work in the fall of 1989 when Allison was 3 and Robert was 4. She secured a position as a secretary for a small electric contractor. I didn't mind at first because it provided us with additional income to feed our growing family. But then I met some of the individuals she worked with, and I got a horrible vibe from them. Especially the men, to be candid. Many of them were lecherous lies. And I knew a handful of them to be severe drug users. Then there was Eliza's friend Glenda, who worked there and helped her get the job. She was married to Mitch, a low-level dealer, who was the first person we went to when we needed to be patched up. They were always fighting and running around on each other. Hell, I believe they even did some swinging, though I never got involved. Mitch was fine for the most part until he started into the whiskey, then he may be a true terror. So I avoided getting too near to him. But Ellie and Glenda quickly became friends, and we spent a lot of time at their place. That New Year's Eve was the first time I had serious doubts about Alice's behavior. We attended a large party at Mitch and Glenda's, and it was the traditional year-end extravaganza with a lot of booze and smoke. I'd been away from the pot for approximately 6 weeks, so it hit me hard still. I was fine until well after midnight when the champagne started flowing. I drank the better part of a bottle on top of a dozen or so beers, and I was ill like a dog. I recall sitting on the driveway in a drunken haze, and it was chilly outside that night. Ellie eventually found me after I'd been out there. Heaving my guts out, carried me in and lay me down on a bed where I passed out. I must have been asleep for a few hours when one of their teenage daughters dragged me out of her room. I staggered into the den looking for my wife, but she was nowhere to be seen. I believed I heard muffled sex sounds coming from one of the rear bedrooms, but I was too stunned to act on it. The next thing I knew, it was dawn. I was on the floor of their den, and Rebecca was sleeping on the sofa. After that night, I vowed never to do anything like that again. I had a successful career, and I could see that society was moving away from accepting recreational drug usage. It was the just say no period. As stories concerning the dangers of illegal drug usage began to spread, I drastically reduced my alcohol consumption and almost completely stopped consuming marijuana. I stopped keeping it and gradually weaned myself off of it over the next 2 years. I genuinely felt I was in it with her, but it became evident to me that she had just stopped using it at home. The first clear indication that things were shifting occurred in the spring. Rebecca went to get a haircut one day and returned as a blonde. I also saw that she was losing some of the weight she gained while having the children. I didn't see her on any diet or exercise program that would help her lose weight. And with her weight reduction and new hair color, which I didn't like, she began to wear a more revealing outfit. When I finally protested about it, she just shrugged and mentioned wanting to look beautiful. But at work things didn't stack up. As spring evolved into summer, she started going out with the girls a couple of evenings a week after work, and she started coming in later and later. After many of her nights out, she tried to slip in discreetly, lock herself in the bathroom and shower. As she was going out and staying out, our sex life simply stopped to exist at the time. It worried me, but later I'd be grateful it did. In mid-July she came home around 2:00 a.m. and I observed her while pretending to be asleep. I watched her peel her garment off, and I was astonished to discover that she was naked below. That was the first clear indication that she was cheating on me. When I approached her the next morning, she looked me straight in the eyes and denied it. "Of course I'm not having an affair," she indignantly said. "Aren't you even close?" I responded, but her attitude spoke volumes. She was taking offense and twisting my suspicions into her own. I knew I'd remained faithful despite occasional offers from some of the girls who worked under me. I realized that was a horrible habit to get into, so I avoided those situations. I wasn't so virtuous that I wouldn't have sex with another lady outside of my marriage if given the opportunity. It was more about my personality. I've never had the gift of gab, and I've never learned how to charm odd women. I was in my element with Rebecca, and attempting to socialize with other women would have been difficult for me. At home our feelings for each other were erratic, but as time passed we became increasingly estranged. Our sex life was a joke, and we weren't engaging in the light-hearted banter we had early in the marriage. I then began to harp on it when she returned home, although a little late, but with the telltale bloodshot eyes and sweet perfume of marijuana about her again. She turned it back on me, informing me unequivocally that she was of legal age, that I was the one who had set her on that path, and if I wasn't willing to party with her, she'd find someone who was. Near the end of September, I made a frantic attempt to save our relationship. I got Elise on her day off, had her sit down, and we talked. I informed her I knew she was smoking pot more heavily than she had ever done before, and I feared she was also using stronger narcotics. I asked her if she still loved me and wanted to marry me, and she looked at me tearfully saying yes, okay. Then I have a few conditions, I told her. You should resign your job and look for another one. I would like to see you in a recovery program, and we should consult a marriage counselor. I'm willing to start over, but only if you're willing to compromise. I don't know, Alex, she replied. I make decent money there and I enjoy working there. They treat me nicely and I'm not going to rehab. I understand if you don't want to do it anymore, but I'm not ready to stop. I am not a junkie or anything, I can handle it. She agreed to meet with a counselor, and we went twice. Then she concluded it was a waste of time and money, which we did not have, and she stopped going inside. The pattern of deviant behavior resumed. I started following her around to the places she frequented after work. She drank with a mix of men and women, and some of the locations she frequented were seedy. I never stayed long enough to see if she went to motels or anything because I needed to get home to care for the children. But a few times, I noticed her wander to the rear of the bar toward the restrooms and linger there far longer than I thought was necessary for her to accomplish whatever business women do in the ladies' room. By December, I had gathered enough circumstantial evidence to move on and obtain concrete proof. Our marriage was a farce, we were always bickering, and she was arriving home late from work every other night, looking as if she'd been riding hard. I was fed up with Rebecca, and what I saw was a pattern of deceit and infidelity. More than that, she had shared the responsibility of mother by always running around partying. I was handling the majority of the parenting because she didn't have time for the kids, and I don't think they noticed. I needed to know what she was doing so I could plan my next move, whether there was still hope for our marriage or whether it was time for a divorce. I began by doing 3 things. First, I went to see my doctor for a checkup, and while there I requested a blood test. I wanted to establish 2 things. 1, I had no sexually transmitted infections. Second, I wanted to demonstrate that I was now drug-free. Next, I surreptitiously collected samples from all 3 of our children and sent them to a DNA lab in another state. I needed definitive confirmation that I was or was not the father of my children. DNA testing was not as sophisticated back then as it is now, but it was sufficient to determine whether I was the father of the children I was raising. I didn't think it would affect my feelings for them. I was their daddy, whether or not I was actually their father. But legally I needed to know one way or the other. If we divorced, I was going to seek custody. My chances would be significantly better if I were their biological father. Finally, I asked around and obtained the name of the greatest divorce attorney in town. So I went to meet him. I expressed my concerns, and he agreed to take me on as a client, referring me to his private investigator, Lily Spradling. She was a no-nonsense woman in her early 40s who I quickly discovered knew everyone in town and everything about them. I told her what I wanted and she took up my case. It was already costing me an arm and a leg, and I still had no clear answers. Everything came to a head on December 24th. It was customary for her employer to close the shop at 5 p.m. on Christmas Eve and invite all of the staff to a large party in their warehouse. I imagined Rebecca would party for a few hours and then return home so we could do some last-minute shopping and get the Santa Claus stuff ready for the kids when they woke up at daybreak on Christmas. But 5 p.m. came and went with no Rebecca. Then 6 p.m. came and went with no sign of her. I began calling Glenn, who was also out of money. She had disappeared from jails and hospitals. I was furious. She didn't even have the decency to control her behavior on Christmas Eve. I was still waiting for her at 9 p.m. When I heard a car door bang and saw my wife stumble up the path to the house. She noticed me standing there, which astonished me. Her face had barely fallen, and she tried to shove by me. But I held her and was overcome by the fragrance she reeked of perspiration and sperm. Hell, she even had dried sperm in her hair. And her eyes were utterly unfocused, as if she'd spent the day getting high. I glanced at her, but she averted her gaze. Then something inside me simply collapsed. I was simply too exhausted to fight her. Besides, I'd soon have a video record of the entire day because I had a feeling she'd do something similar. So I instructed Lily to set up surveillance. By then, Lily had discovered that Ellery had been recognized as a woman who frequented a sleazy motel on the rough side of town with a group of rough-looking people. Lily had bribed a clerk at the motel and was allowed to install a concealed camera in one of the rooms with the understanding that if Alice arrived, she and anyone she was with would be directed to that room. Ellery and I spent a tense Christmas day circling each other, waiting for the other to go down. It was the stillness before the storm. I knew Rebecca was off work for the next week. They always closed for the week between Christmas and New Year's. So I wasn't too concerned about what she'd do the day after Christmas. Lily contacted me at the store, and her voice seemed desperate. "You should come see the tape from the other day." She added. "How awful is it?" I said. "Worse than you could think," she remarked. I figured Rebecca had a boyfriend, maybe two. But I was completely unprepared for what I saw on Lily's surveillance tape. Lily had me sit in the unoccupied office of one of her associates, plug the tape into the VCR, and leave me alone to process what was on it. The video before she began playing it. She handed me a surveillance report that documented Alice's activity before she arrived at the motel. That was all the evidence I needed because it was quite graphic in nature. I'm not sure how Lily accomplished it, but she managed to get her associate into the company's party, and he had first-hand stories of what happened. It began as a conventional party, lots of drinking and even kissing under the mistletoe. Nothing very dramatic. After an hour, however, the Christmas songs on the boombox were replaced by dance music, and Rebecca was spotted dirty dancing with several individuals, including her friend Glenda. According to the account, Ellery and Glenda had nearly had sex in the center of the room while the men in the audience surrounded and cheered them on. Then it struck the fan. Rebecca was observed heading out to the parking lot with a male. The private eye set up a post so he could view what they were doing. They started smoking a joint, and while they were doing so, he pulled out a vial of Coke, which they shared many spoons of. When they were finished, he watched Alice's head fall into the man's lap, and the man's head thrown back with a smile on his face. After a few minutes, Alice's head came back up, and she was wiping something from her mouth while smiling maliciously. They returned to the party around midnight. The party ended, but instead of driving home, Rebecca followed 3 pickup trucks to the motel where she had been seen previously. And that's when the tape began. My wife, my soon-to-be ex-wife, entered the room with 4 guys who I would describe as hard-looking. They were all approximately 6 feet tall, well-built, and a couple of them were even rather attractive if you like rough-edged men. 3 joints were lit and started making the rounds while one of the men sat at a table and began drawing several large lines of coke. As the room filled with smoke, everyone, including Rebecca, formed a line of each nostril while she grinned seductively. When she finished hers, they got down to business. What I saw on the recordings put every spicy movie I'd ever heard of to shame. And her performance with all of them was professional. I had seen enough, yet I did not. I fast-forwarded through the tape to see how awful things had become. And they did grow worse. However, by that point, I had become immune to further shock. So when she confronted all 4 of them at once, it didn't really register. I believe the expression on my face spoke volumes because Lily was accompanied by her associate who had followed Rebecca to the party. "Take me to a local tavern for a therapeutic beverage," I said after a few drinks with Burl, which stands for Burlington. I felt a little better. We discussed what I intended to accomplish, and he agreed to help me when it was time to serve the divorce papers. He was a large, powerful man who turned out to be a softie on the inside. And he sympathized with me. Earl had been through similar experiences. And he understood what I was going through. It was all I could do to be courteous to Rebecca that night when I got home. Fortunately, she made it easy for me to get dressed and go out with her pals that night. I didn't bother seeing her leave. I was playing with Allison in the den when she departed. The next morning, I went to see my lawyer and told him I was ready to file the paperwork. I wanted them prepared for New Year's Eve. And I wanted Beryl to serve her on New Year's Eve. I prepared a surprise for my soon-to-be ex-wife. I informed Rebecca that I'd have to work until 9:00 p.m. and would prefer to spend the night at home. I urged her to stay at home with me, knowing full well that she would not. What I had planned. She was intending to attend Glenda and Mitt's year-end party as she always does. And she just laughed at my lame attempt to shame her into remaining at home. "If you want to be a stick in the mud, go ahead," she said, "but I am ready to party. Can't you at least remain long enough to watch the kids till I return home from work?" I said. "Why should I let the young rugrats ruin my enjoyable time? I'll get a babysitter if you can't pull yourself away from that store in time to save your adorable tiny infants." I was stunned. I knew she'd lost interest in parenting. But the chilly manner she spoke about the kids stunned me. "It's all right, Rebecca," I spoke slowly. "I will make the arrangements. You do not have to turn your hands for your children." I called the neighbor's teenage daughter, who was the kids' regular sitter, and requested her to watch them for about an hour. She agreed. And I urged her to call the store the moment Rebecca left the house. A little after 6:30 the girl called, and I handed over the store to my assistant. I called my brother, who had promised to meet me at the house to help pack Ellie's belongings. His wife drove him over and left with my children, who had been informed they would be spending the night with their grandparents. We packed up Alice's possessions and carried them to a storage facility in my pickup truck before driving to Mitch and Glenda's shortly after. Beryl was parked in his car in a protected area, watching the home. "She has not departed," Beryl said. "It's a safe bet she'll stay the night." "Good," I said, as he poured me a cup of coffee from a thermos he carried with him. We observed the home as people arrived and left until midnight, when fireworks and other celebrations erupted all around us. The three of us exited and approached the house. No one opened the door at first, most likely due to the noise. But Beryl hammered on the door and eventually, someone I didn't know opened it. "Rebecca Thompson," he bellowed as we entered the foyer. It took a few minutes for someone to bring her to the door. And when she arrived, she appeared to be completely wasted. "Yeah, what?" she began. Then she noticed me and my brother standing on either side of Beryl. And I believe our expressions told her we weren't there to join the party. "What are you doing here?" she started again. But Beryl cut her off. "Rebecca Thompson," he replied, slapping one of the letters he was holding into her hand. "You are served, Mr. Alex Thompson filed a petition in civil court seeking divorce on the grounds of adultery and mental abuse. And the court issued an order prohibiting you from going within 1,500 feet of the domicile formerly occupied by you and said husband. And this envelope contains the key and the address of the storage facility where your possessions have been transported. You sorry son of a," Rebecca sputtered. And I saw Mitch, Glenda, and all of their pals gathering behind her. "I gave you an opportunity, Rebecca," I explained calmly. "I gave you the option to clean up your act. But you decided to mess with me. You have made your bed, now lie in it." We heard a clamor of fury rising. Beryl then unbuttoned his jacket, displaying the revolver in his belt. He placed his hand on the handle and looked down at the crowd. Then we turned and walked boldly out of the house, the door slamming shut behind us. I doubt Beryl would have used his pistol, but it had made him a very good peacekeeper. Then I returned to my parents to spend the remainder of New Year's Eve and prepare for the battle ahead. It was not long in coming. The truth is, Ella began stepping in her own garbage right away. And it was the start of the worst year ever. While we were packing her belongings, I contacted a locksmith to come to our house and change the locks. But that did not deter Rebecca. While we were spending New Year's Day at my parents' house, she busted a pane in the kitchen door to gain entry and evidently plundered our bedroom. Maybe she was searching for something, I am not sure. It did not matter. I phoned the cops and charged her with breaking and entering because it was her first arrest and occurred in conjunction with my serving her the night before. Her lawyer was able to get the accusations withdrawn a week later. I received my blood work results from the doctor and breathed a sigh of relief when everything came back negative. I added those documents to my growing evidence file and received more positive news the following week. The DNA findings confirmed that all 3 of the children were definitely mine. Whatever Rebecca had done behind my back began after the babies were delivered. That made my strategy simple. I was planning to seek full custody and just grant Rebecca supervised visitation. To my disbelief, she battled everything tooth and claw. I would have assumed based on her behavior that she would be grateful for her independence, that she would appreciate not having a husband and family to prevent her from doing what she wanted. But I didn't consider the demons that my father had glimpsed lurking in her heart all those years ago. Once I established myself as the adversary in her eyes, she was not going to let me win without a struggle. However, it appeared the more she attempted to oppose me, the worse things got for her, and the more angry she became with me. This included another arrest for marijuana possession, which resulted in a heavy fine and a 6-month suspension of her driver's license. It took until midsummer before I received the divorce I had been seeking. Then we went to family court for the custody problem, and she pulled out what she believed was her heavy artillery, despite the fact that I was the one who introduced her to drugs. My lawyer presented evidence that I had been drug-free for about a year when Rebecca went too far. It appeared that I might be granted complete custody. It was a sweltering night in September, and I had just left the store. The only warning I received was the abrupt shifting of numerous pairs of feet. Then I felt something like a large stick or a baseball bat hit me hard in the rib cage. I just managed to roll away from a hit to my head that glanced off my shoulder. I managed to rise up on my knees and fight myself only to discover that I was being pursued by 3 assailants, 2 of whom I knew from Alice's Christmas Eve gangbang video. I was able to engage the guy carrying the cudgel, preventing him from landing a serious strike on me. And I managed to land some strong blows to the guy's belly. However, this meant that I was vulnerable to attacks from the other 2's fists and feet. I'm not sure if they would have killed me, but I heard noises down the street and collapsed in agony. The last thing I remember was a kid leaning over me, asking if I was okay, and then shouting for someone to go get aid. The very next thing I saw was the face of a woman. And at first it was hazy, but as my mind cleared, I realized she was a nurse, and a very attractive one at that. She had a slender face, but when she spotted me approaching she smiled, and her entire face lit up. That was my introduction to Lily Pauling. I remained in the hospital for 3 weeks, and I got to know Lily quite well. She was quite simply the most stunning woman I had ever seen. She was rightly titled since she exuded lily and calmness that stems from inner peace. She was somewhat taller than average and rather thin, with soft blonde hair cut tastefully just below her shoulders. She was all but flat-chested, but if it upset her, she didn't show it, and it certainly didn't worry me. I sensed something there right away, and would converse while she took care of me. I found her to be a great listener and smart beyond her years. She was perhaps a year older than me, but had never been married or been near to it. She informed me she'd had a few boyfriends, but none had made her heart race. She then beamed her megawatt smile and winked at me. While I was in the hospital, I met with the police numerous times, and it became evident that I had been attacked at the request of my ex-wife for reasons I couldn't comprehend. She and her friends were arrested and charged with attempted murder. I let her sweat until the start of the following year. Then I met her to strike a bargain if she dropped all custody claims. I'd look at getting the charges lowered to aggravated assault. "Why should I help you?" she growled. "I don't believe you want to spend the next 15 years in prison." I responded, "I'm offering you the option of seeing your children every 3 to 6 years or 15 years and never seeing them again." Don't be dumb as you were when you turned down my offer to save our marriage. Remember, if you had done what I requested, I would have overlooked everything you had done up to that time. None of this would have happened, she said. Oh, I said. And this time I scoffed at her. I was done being Alice's doormat. I suggested that you listen to the story your buddies are telling. They claim you hired them to beat me up. They are informing the cops that you wanted me killed. Rebecca, they are giving up on you. And your only hope is to make a deal. I could see her shoulders slumping at that. In the end, she gave up and struck a deal with the DA. Pleading guilty to aggravated assault. She went off for 3 to 6 years. And I was finally free of her, almost certainly. But it had left me financially and emotionally exhausted. I was compelled to sell the house and return to my parents' home with the 3 children. My mother was a godsend, taking care of the kids and doing her best to assuage their anxieties after leaving the hospital. I had another 2 months of rehabilitation during which I was unable to work. I was covered by corporate insurance and received workers' compensation. However, the Christmas season was approaching, and they required a store manager on site. Christmas 1991 was a vast improvement from the previous year's disaster. Nonetheless, it made me realize how lonely I felt. The lady I thought I loved, the mother of my children, had turned against me and ruined her life. Money was tight, so I couldn't do as much for the kids as I wanted. I was still in pain and depressed from the preceding 18 months. And then things got worse. After the first of the year, the company I'd been working for gave me an option. I could take a manager's post in another state or accept a layoff. I didn't want either. So I resigned and obtained a position on the floor of a huge retail shop. It was a considerable step down from my previous work as a manager. And I earned considerably less money essentially. It was like beginning over in my career. But the work was easy. And the hours were convenient for me because they allowed me to spend nights with my children. I rented a tiny house. And we moved out of my parents' home. It was in a low-rent community with little to call home. Overall, the winter of 1992 was the worst point of my life. The only positive aspect was that I rejected the seductive call of drugs and booze after observing Alice's self-destruction. I knew better than to follow that road. But I'd be lying if I said I never felt tempted. Then an angel crossed my path for the second time. It was on a Saturday. I was at the grocery store with the kids. And they were being a handful by this point. They were 8, 6, and 5. They were good kids. But they were still kids. I was fussing with Robert, who was acting up when I heard a voice behind me. Alex Thompson. I turned to see Lily approaching. We hugged in greeting. And she then dropped down to greet all 3 of the children by name. I was amazed she had only met them once or twice but knew their names and ages. That was the first time I realized how great she was with children. As they cannot write, we talked. And she appeared really worried about how I was going. Then we looked up at the same instant. And our gazes met. It was only for a moment. But I believe we knew the spark was there. Would you like to go to dinner sometime? I replied hesitantly. Alex, I owe you so much for all of your care while I was in the hospital. I was simply doing my job, Lily said. But I have to say it was a pleasure. And I would love to go out with you again. Do you have any plans tonight? I simply stared at her later. When I got to know her better, I realized it was her way. She is really direct and knows how to get to the point without wading through a lot of nonsense. Anyway, we exchanged phone numbers. And she then gave me a small kiss on my cheek. It was nothing, yet it gave me shivers all over. And my daughter Allison noticed immediately. Is she going to be our new mom? She asked me as we finished our shopping. Oh, I do not know, sweetie, I stated. It's far too early to say. Why would you like her to be your new mother? She asked. Oh yes, she replied cheerfully. How about you guys? I asked Mary and Robert. Do you believe you could accept Miss Lily as your new mother? Sure, Dad, Robert replied. She's pretty cool. We will see then, I laughed, but it was too early. And she might have something to say about it. But do you like her, Daddy? Mary said with her usual quiet attentiveness. Yes. I do, I replied, but as I have stated, we still have a long way to go before reaching that stage. That night, I took Lily to a steakhouse, nothing spectacular, but a nice setting and delicious cuisine. I realized she was everything Rebecca was not. I wouldn't say she's flawless, since she has her flaws, but I've never encountered somebody with a better attitude. I've never been around someone with such a bright attitude on life. Rebecca was doom and gloom, and she expended an inordinate amount of energy worrying about things over which she had no control. Things that had already happened. She was filled with regret and remorse, and it always dragged me down with her. With Lily, every day represents a fresh opportunity. She is a forward-thinking, planning, and well-organized individual who never wastes time worrying about the past. After the day is finished, she puts it behind her and only alludes to it when absolutely necessary. It wasn't long before we realized we were quickly falling in love. After we had been dating for about 6 weeks, I took her to meet my family, who were really impressed. My father, in fact, took one look at her and instructed me to do anything I could to keep her. The kids, of course, fell in love with Lily nearly as quickly as I did, and she stepped right into the surrogate mother role. We became more acquainted throughout the course of the summer, although we both avoided sex at first. Following my experience with Rebecca, I was terrified of letting myself go with a lady, of letting my feelings out, and she was not someone who engaged in casual sex. When I make love with you, I want it to be the pinnacle of a romantic relationship. She informed me one night when we were sitting on the sofa at my house after she had been over for supper. As she had done for months, it was mid-November, and we were beginning to talk loosely about a future together. I love you, Alex, but I don't want you to do this until you're ready and until we are both ready to commit to this for the long run. She went on to say, I gave up my virginity in college to a person I thought I loved, and he destroyed my heart since then. I've been waiting for the proper man. I suppose you are that dude. But wait until you're ready to take the final step. If you walk in faith with me, it won't happen, God. Lily, I desperately desire you. But you have no idea how good it makes me feel to hear you say that. I explained what I had gone through with Rebecca. To hear a lady associate sex with love was music to my ears. Soon, my love, she whispered. She then kissed me softly and deeply. A week or 2 later, I told my mother that I was going to ask Lily to marry me. And she did something she had never done for us before. I suppose it was because of the power of our marriage. She walked to her bedroom, opened her jewelry box, and took out her old engagement ring. She gave it to me with tears in her eyes. Give it to her with my blessing, she said. It is not a large fancy diamond, just a little stone in an ordinary setting. But I have a hunch it will mean far more to her than a sparkling new bauble that will set you back an arm and a leg. There is a lot of love in this ring, and I want her to have it. She is the best thing that has ever happened to you, and I want her to know that. I chose to wait until Christmas Eve to make my pitch. I had chosen to conduct Santa Claus at my parents' place where they could have their stuff with their cousins and grandparents. And 2, I wanted to be alone with Lily that night. I picked her up at the hospital after I finished work. And then one of my parents came to take up the kids for the Christmas Eve service at the church where Lily had long been a member and where I had begun attending. Lily sang in the choir, and I looked lovingly into her eyes while they sang. Later, we were able to get the kids down. It was not easy, then set out the Santa gifts. After that, I told my parents that we were returning to my place, and I winked at my mother to communicate my intentions non-verbally. I turned on the Christmas tree lights and placed some holiday music on the stereo. Then we sat down on the sofa, and I took the box from where I'd hidden it among the cushions. Lily, I have a special Christmas gift for you that I want you to open right now, I said softly. I handed her the box, and when she opened it, her eyes widened, and her mouth dropped open with delight, surprise. And Lily, will you marry me? Her response was to smother me with kisses. Our hands were all over each other, and we didn't stop once finished. I looked into her eyes and she looked back. Our emotions pouring unspoken between us. "Merry Christmas, my darling," she whispered. "Merry Christmas, love," I responded back. Lily and I were married at our church in mid-March. And we've been happily married for nearly 14 years. My kids quickly became hers, at least in her heart. At first they adapted quickly to their new mother. There have only been 2 black clouds in our lives together since then. One is the fact that Lily was unable to bear me her own child. We tried like Dickens and eventually discovered that there was a problem with her uterus. Lily never dwelt on her sorrow and instead focused on helping me raise the children. The second arrived after we'd been married for 6 years, when Rebecca called me unexpectedly and informed me that she had contracted HIV several years ago and was now dying of AIDS. She'd gotten out of prison after 3 years and ended up on the streets, performing tricks. She was in hospice and wanted to see her children before dying. I was dreading the visit, but surprisingly enough, Rebecca had made peace with herself and with me. She stopped blaming me for everything horrible that had happened to her during her life. She forgives me for the faults I committed throughout our marriage. And I forgive her for the anguish she put me through during our divorce. After visiting with the kids, she requested to speak with Lily alone. And when she emerged, Lily was in tears later. We were driving home, and she told me some of what they talked about. "She told me not to let you leave," she said. She said the worst mistake she'd ever made was not listening to you when you offered to overlook her transgressions and save the marriage. You offered her a chance, and she realizes she blew it by turning her back on you. I believe it is why she was so resentful about the divorce. Eliza's final act before passing away was to give Lily permission to adopt her children. She'd resisted it for all of the difficult, painful years following the divorce, but in the end, she did the right thing by allowing the love of my life to genuinely be a mother. With Lily by her side, I rapidly returned into management and ascended through the ranks of the corporate office. I am a regional director for the company where I work. And I have done well. Lily is still a nurse, working in children's care, where her unique abilities are most needed. Some of the instances she deals with hurt her heart, while others inflame her fury. She has a temper, but she keeps it well veiled. Mary was so captivated with her stepmother that she decided to follow in her footsteps and become a nurse. Robert is still in college, having joined the Army National Guard immediately out of high school. I am concerned that the longer the conflict in Iraq lasts, the more likely he may be called up. But that is his decision and I fully back him. Similarly, Allison is in college with the goal of becoming a teacher. It's been a fulfilling existence that I don't believe I would have had if Lily hadn't entered my life when she did. Santa Claus has been set up, and Lily is sitting on the sofa next to me, cuddling up into my arms. Bing Crosby is quietly crooning White Christmas on the stereo, and we gaze into the slowly baking fire as I take one last sip of my glass and set it on the coffee table. Tomorrow, there will be laughing and excitement as my family shares the gifts we've all bought for each other. We'll peel open the parcels and marvel at the thought that went into each present. Then we will gather in the kitchen to make the Christmas feast. It will be a lovely occasion, as it always is. But tonight, in the calm of Christmas Eve night, I am enjoying the finest gift I have ever received, the one that keeps giving. Tonight, I bask in the warm glow from the love and devotion of a good lady and in the love and commitment I've been able to express to her throughout time. Lily is a synonym for elegance and an unearned gift from God. And that is exactly what my Lily means to me. I hope you enjoyed that story. Here is another one. My gut wrenched as I reached the restaurant's entryway. I didn't know if I could eat anything exactly as I was ready to open the door. A blast of wind swept the umbrella out of my hands, and some of the water that it had preserved, since it was such a cheap and almost useless umbrella, ended up on my face and in my hair, which I had spent hours styling specifically for this occasion. As I began to lash out, the doorman opened the door and nearly knocked me down before apologizing. He grasped my hand and supported me. I was certain my hair was not intact. I sighed and moved past him to the main desk. Prime Angus Steakhouse was a prominent restaurant in the Windy City, Our hometown, well, maybe just in my hometown. I'd have to wait and see what responses came this evening. But I was hoping to say we again after everything was said and done. It wasn't Jean and George. But Josh knew that I had always wanted to eat here. Even after all these years, Mr. and Mrs. Conrad. I addressed myself to the maitre d' as he looked up. 730. Oh, this is Alice and Joshua. He announced enthusiastically. Just a moment, please. We will show you to your table shortly. The restaurant's reservation system used both first and last names. It was both humorous and nice to hear our names stated aloud and in the same phrase again. My hair may be messed up, but you can't take my smile away with a nail hammer. I was told Josh hadn't arrived yet, but the host led me to our table nonetheless. 5 minutes later, I was drinking white wine out of a glass. I wanted to surprise my husband by ordering his favorite drink, but I reconsidered because it would appear arrogant. I didn't want to do or say anything tonight that may jeopardize our potential joyous reunion. I'm looking forward to seeing Josh for the first time in about a year. I remembered the good times. These have been some fantastic occasions in our partnership. Josh and I met the week after I graduated from college. My father had gotten me a position at Wilkins & Batchelor LLC, a prominent accounting firm. Josh was a high-profile client due to his parents' unexpected death and a sizable inheritance. Not to mention a trust fund our firm controlled. The firm was preoccupied with transferring the assets that he inherited at the time. I had no involvement with Josh's funds. I was an entry-level accountant. We fell in love at first sight and started dating. And were married 15 months later, in fact. My business proposed that we draft a prenuptial agreement that would be agreed to by all parties. What I admired the most about my husband was his charisma and enthusiasm. In the years leading up to and following our marriage, his personality matched mine perfectly. We could discuss anything. The way he articulated everything and the passion he emanated made me see him as more mature than his years. I instantly remembered the night it all ended. The night Josh fell silent. It happened on Valentine's Day the year prior. And all credit goes to me. Josh and I had a fairy tale romance for the first 3 years of our relationship. Love, sex and companionship, it was all there. And I was satisfied. Contentment, that term began to torture and terrify me. The tar in my honey barrel of contentment turned out to be Brett Stratton. He too was a wealthy customer of my firm. And when I met him, I was already on my way to becoming a junior partner. We all know how history unfolds. Even though I was aware of the risks, I proceeded with the purchase. The subtle flirtation made me shake with excitement. Dressing better and sexier on days when I knew he'd be in the office. I trembled much more turning down his lunch invitation the first time. The little touches on my arm or knee elevated the game and the risk to new heights. I had everything under control until I didn't. Josh was equally eager about our corporate celebration as I was. After all, he knew quite a few individuals there. Josh had taken his hobby of tool patenting to new heights by the time we got married. And we performed a surprise demonstration at a London company the week before the party. I had absolutely no concerns about my husband. He recommended me to have a good time at the party without overindulging. He promised to come see me at midnight on the day of the party to make sure everything was fine. I knew it was more than that. But I didn't think he had any grounds to suspect me of anything wrong. Brett filled my glass that night, but to be honest, I was already giving myself a 30 chance that, given the perfect circumstances, Brett and I would make it work. Maybe we would just kiss, but deep down, I knew I'd never rule out sex in a dark conference room with the door shut and the curtains drawn. I experienced my first instance of cheating. The sex was an excellent, mind-blowing sexual experience. If it hadn't been, I'd never have returned to the well. When we returned to the party about an hour later, I was surprised that no one had noticed our absence. I didn't feel guilty until I got into my car and rushed home. I was astonished when I arrived at the house just 4 minutes before Josh phoned. "Miss, returning to the present. Are you still waiting for your guest?" I scowled and checked my phone. Josh arrived 20 minutes late despite the lily period. I apologized to the server and decided to get an appetizer for the two of us to avoid any potential humiliation. I wondered where he was. Another fleeting thought entered my head, which I quickly put to the back of my mind with a perceptible cold. I mentally returned to those terrible weeks following the celebration. Josh called at midnight just as promised. I got myself together and dealt with it. And by the time we said goodnight, I was confident he had no idea what I'd done. Lying in bed that night, I reflected on my situation. There had been no Martian rage done there. No unexpected loss of brain function. I understood what had happened and why well. Mostly why. My mind cleared as I reflected on the incredible sex I had just experienced and what had preceded it. I felt convinced I should give Brett another try or 2 or 3. But that was the last of it. I told myself that this was something special for me. Unlike what Josh and I shared. I rejected the concept like a rag. As most cheaters or porn addicts do when they are in a committed relationship. I was also aware that Brett meant nothing to me. At least not as much as my spouse. Brett and I met again after one of our lunches. And in addition to another round of great sex, he gave me a disposable cell phone. Brett knew Josh. Or at least was aware of him. They had met at 2 distinct company events, both of which were attended by employees and clients. Both were aware of one another's financial situations. Brett may have been a little jealous that Josh's fortune was significantly higher than his own. In retrospect, but he never said it aloud. After the Christmas party until early February, we were together 3 times. But Josh's name was never mentioned before or during our bedtime chats. I'd only promised myself 3 times. So I should have stopped. If everything would have changed. The tablespoon of tar in the honey barrel constituted an actual intrusion. Brett texted me from a burner phone 2 days before Valentine's Day. Something he hadn't done previously. He frequently called while I was at work. He asked to spend a few hours with me on Valentine's Day. I told him no right away. But he insisted and nearly pleaded. He asked me what my plans were with Josh and for how long. He told me that we would date within those parameters. And that I would arrive home on time. I created difficulties. I made excuses for even the most obvious things. I played into his hands. I also knew I'd given before I stated it aloud. Everything inside me was screaming at me not to do it. But I ignored my inner voice and tossed common sense out the window. There was no sex that day. I apologized for working a few extra hours and assured Josh that it would not interfere with our special evening. Brett and I met in a posh restaurant on the south side, somewhat far from my residence. My lone gift that night was an extremely expensive necklace, which signified just one thing: it was bringing me back from my fairy tale. Brett had fallen for me and I couldn't have it. I denied his present, which he did not take well. We fought until we witnessed the same expression. Questions from both staff and guests. Then he pleaded with me passionately. And I told him a long list of reasons why we would never be together. As a result, we arrived at the restaurant 20 minutes later than expected. When I learned this, I panicked and told Brett to drive me back to the office to collect my car. Now I had to show up 45 minutes later than I had promised Josh. Maybe I would have gotten over it. And everything would have ended nicely that night. With only Brett and I finding out. If it hadn't been for the flat tire, we would never have been found. And the damn car tracking app to this day. I have no idea what caused the flat tire. It was raining. And Brett was urgently attempting to change it. Concerned about my tiredness and the potential implications. At the very least, his heart was functioning properly. But he never truly mastered this life skill. When I peeked out the fogged window 40 minutes later and saw my husband's furious face through the streams of rain, I assumed my life had been cut short. And not just metaphorically. It seemed like a long time had passed. Yet it had most likely only been 30 seconds when Brett noticed that he was merely standing there. I suspected but never confirmed that he had swiftly walked to the front of the car to make some sort of excuse. Whatever arguments he offered, they were not heard. Josh kept an eye on me until Brett was finished. At that time, my husband struck him across the face with a swing, causing Brett to fall to the icy asphalt, prompting me to get out of the car. Josh had already turned his back on me when I urged him to stop, so I squatted down to assist my boyfriend. Brett had fallen into the damp street and his 5,000 suit was utterly destroyed. I hurried after my husband, seeing that he was okay, until I felt someone grab my arm forcefully and hold me in place. "Let him go," Brett urged sharply yet kindly. "He will require a minute or a day. And he is not in the mood to talk to you right now. I can tell you that if I were him, I would prefer to be alone." His appearance informed me he was a man. After how I handled his gift and his feelings for me, I needed to go see him. I cried, "Let me go." Brett viewed the situation as it was. He was the only one among the three of us who was not in the clouds. He let go of my hand, shaking his head. "Then go." He warned me, "But it will do you no good. Get your belongings out of the car and call a taxi. I'm heading to the ER to see whether my jaw is fractured." When I saw the maitre d' walking toward my table, I stopped thinking about Valentine's Day past. "Damn. These people are impatient," the lady said. "May I ask for your guests' phone numbers? Can I assist him in ensuring his well-being?" God. I wondered what was going on. But then I realized they were probably watching me and wondering why I hadn't called or texted my husband. Noah responded emphatically, "He is on his way. I just heard from him." I picked up my empty glass and carefully twisted it in my hands. "I would definitely like another, please." And the waitress who was standing immediately behind him jumped out of her seat in an instant. My mind shifted back to the past when I arrived. The cab ride had lasted nearly an hour. The house was dark and I assumed it was cold. Josh was not home, which was not surprising. Brett was right when he said he needed time. Surprisingly, I discovered that I too required time to craft responses to some of the questions my husband was likely to ask. I never anticipated Job wouldn't return home. The last time I saw him, he was driving away from our neighborhood of small, sparsely built-up mansions. I was on my way home, so I didn't have time to turn around and catch up with him. I realized that all of his stuff was missing. The movers must have reached him while I was at work. I started sobbing, but then I became angry. How could he simply abandon me? They didn't even talk to me about it. I sent him an emotional email. He never replied. 2 days later, I resolved to try to find him and possibly speak with my parents. His sister, and my sister Sheila, was heartbroken when she answered the phone. "How could you?" she yelled into the telephone. "I adore that man. He was the greatest thing that ever happened to you. So this is how you reward him? What is wrong with you?" She was the first messenger. Beth, Josh's sister, was considerably worse. "What do you want from me? You're a..." These were the first words she spoke. "No greetings or anything. I want to know where he is." I stood my ground. "I need to apologize and make things right. Good luck." She responded with pity. "I loved you like a sister. Why describe it to me? I believed you were the best thing in his life. It does not matter. I do not know where he is. He merely texted me about what had transpired. He didn't go into depth and simply stated he'd get back to me. But he needed time to reflect about his life." When I called back 3 weeks later, Beth said she knew where he was but would not tell me. She advised me to either leave it alone and hope for the best or to file for divorce. After speaking with my folks and getting over their disappointment, I found myself contemplating, was I actually such a nasty person? Of course, I knew the answer to that question. It took months of therapy to confirm it. During that moment I promised myself to wait it out. I would not file for divorce. I would also keep my pledge of chastity. This continued until mid-April. Brett was suspicious and maintained his distance. I believed he was anxious about both my marriage and himself. When I inquired about him with my team leader, I was told that he had missed an appointment the week before due to hospitalization. I became concerned. Found out which hospital he was in, and went to see him. He informed me he'd been attacked. I don't think he believed it, and I certainly didn't. But I didn't intend to fight back. His final remarks greatly saddened me, Alice. He spoke in subdued tones due to the injury to his neck. I'd rather not see you again. Dinner had failed. And as had my Valentine's Day. Damn it, I thought. Why invite me to see him here if it will merely dislily me? The owner of the table was talking to the waiter. Most likely on how to treat me more tenderly. It had been nearly an hour since I had sat down at the table. I looked away from the window, trying to figure out how I might leave with any dignity. Since an hour earlier the rain had intensified. Despite the rain, something in the brightly illuminated cafe across the street drew my attention. A stunning blonde with almost white hair sat looking into her lover's eyes and holding his hand across the table. When I moved my sight to the gentleman, my heart almost stopped. It was my husband Josh. Perhaps it wasn't the man. He wore a well-groomed beard. The rain drummed against the glass. I scrutinized him, hoping that against all odds I was mistaken. They were laughing together and establishing eye contact. They were plainly a couple. They lowered their gaze and uncrossed their arms. The man turned and gazed out the window. Glanced directly at me. I was certain of it. I jumped up from my seat, driven by pure emotion and excitement. Wallet. Coat check, I muttered, and immediately crossed the dining room. After taking out my wallet, I handed the maitre d' my credit card and instructed him to bill me for the lobster tail, promising to return and sign the receipt, of course. By the time I entered the cafe they had already left. By then, I was certain it had been his intention all along. They must have been prepared to leave, just waiting for me to make a move before messing with me. I'd never felt so helpless and ashamed as I walked out of the cafe. The waiter approached me in the rain with my card, receipt and phone number, which I had left on the table. Another pity-filled look that, after all these months, went down smoother than rain and was insincere. Wishing me luck, I returned to the steakhouse lobby and got a taxi. It was just past 11 p.m. on the way home. I ordered the driver to stop at a booze store and gave him $120 to come in and get me some for the night. Money remained the least of my issues. I was able to carry it all the way to my front door. I held onto it, and when I walked in, the dam burst. I had high hopes for this evening, hopes for reconciliation and love. I had many additional fancies in my dreams instead. I was alone, soaked and freezing. He wouldn't return. I'd never get the chance to explain myself or apologize for my mistakes. Worst of all, he had discovered someone else. Another bout of tears flowed as I realized how dumb that sounded in my own brain. I strolled to the kitchen, retrieved a wine corkscrew from the desk drawer, but quickly returned it and reached into my bag for a bottle of vodka. The wine could wait. I chose to live alone and chaste for a year. I accepted and even welcomed my loneliness with enthusiasm. My parents' sister co-workers, and even a few acquaintances I had kept in touch with since college tried to persuade me to keep living my life. Only my therapist stood out from the crowd. She informed me emphatically that being alone and discovering why I had wrecked my marriage was far from the worst thing that could happen, much better. She said than another failed romance that night. As I poured a third vodka into my glass, it felt quite strange. I was really alone. Even worse than the disastrous night I returned home to find Josh gone. So this was it. It's time to put on my big girl panties and go on with my life. The ringing of the doorbell caused me to jump. What else might tonight bring? What more could I bear? There was a delivery man. He even wore a uniform. I signed my name, and he handed me a box with basic brown wrapping and a bouquet of black roses. My heart sank again. I placed both objects on the kitchen table and examined them closely. The first thing I noticed was the roses. They were not black, as in dead. They were actually dead, dried, and rotten red roses. Probably the same bouquet Josh carried in his left hand when he stood there a year ago. Stunned and devastated, looking at me from the passenger seat, I needed to think about it. Josh had spent the entire evening on his own terms, which was clearly planned for some time. This has to alter immediately. I took out my phone and began scrolling through my messages until I discovered an unknown number that Josh had used to invite me to dinner. Then I typed erased. And typed some more until I had the message I wanted to send. So mission done. One question: what's inside the box? The answer arrived nearly instantly: a present. I was not going to play this game anymore. I hit the phone button to dial the number while my hands were shaking. It switched to voicemail. I tried again and got the same result. I leaned back in my chair collecting my thoughts. And drained my glass of vodka. Of course I typed. It took him approximately a minute to reply. I am not lying, you won't know until you open it. I opened the box. It was typical of those used to store shirts or sweaters. Inside was the dreaded thick manila envelope. When I opened it and slipped my fingers inside, expecting its contents, many 12 by 18 centimeters glossy images spilled out onto the table. There was my spouse and the blonde from the caf. They were standing side by side, casually dressed. And someone was taking a photograph of them with the Grand Canyon in the background. It made me sob. We had always intended to vacation there after having our first child. Another snapshot shows a lovely blonde woman in a scarcely their bikini in a tropical environment. The woman was exquisite. Right down to her adorable little legs. I suddenly became too depressed to be jealous. That would probably happen later. Other photos showed the two of them engaged in various activities or simply looking at each other with love in their eyes. I shoved them away. I looked inside the envelope and found two items: a handwritten note from my husband and a cover sheet captioned "Dissolution of Marriage." Looking through it, I noticed Josh's attorney's name and phone number on it. I took up the note. Alice, first and foremost, I'd like to apologize for my dishonesty today. I reflected about what our reunion would be like and how it would end. Finally, I understood that we would never be on equal footing if you were unable to experience what I did on Valentine's Day last year. Telegraphing about it would have been ineffective for both of us. I couldn't find the words to communicate my sadness or displeasure with you last year. So I left. As Paul Simon stated 50 years ago in his song, any words I had spoken at the time would have fallen on me like quiet showers. As would yours. I felt we both needed silence. So I took a different path and began a new life. Albeit not a temporary one. This is where and how I met Tiffany. She helped me recover and comprehend. Sometimes she even argued for you. I will not bore you with specifics. The photograph should be sufficient if, after seeing them and reading this, you still want to reconcile. Call this number to arrange an actual day and time to talk. I don't think any of us will easily forgive the other. But I am available if you want to try. Josh. After reviewing it, I put the letter aside. I saw that the number provided was different from the one we had just talked about. For a brief moment, I felt a sense of relief flood over me. There was still a chance. But the euphoric anticipation was overshadowed by a heavy cloud of reality. Josh showed me exactly what I had done to him and demonstrated it extremely well. I understood how he felt what I had done to this man. My own spouse. He could do to me in return in that moment. I recognized that I could never be with someone who could hurt me as deeply as he had, just as I had harmed him. He was still a teacher. And he continued to take me to school. I could never sincerely love a man who could attack my heart and emotions in such a cold and brutal manner. And I would have to live with myself for a long time, knowing that I too was that sort of man. The last thing we deserved was each other. I recognized that my time would be spent on self-reflection and learning how to be a better person before I could trust myself with a new love's heart. For a brief moment, my inner voice told me not to give up so easily. I grabbed the images in my hands again and carefully examined them. Despite the rain, Josh remained thrilled with Tiffany. It was as evident from across the street as it was in the crystal clear images. With a heavy heart and a sigh, I sat silently for over 20 minutes. My thoughts finally ceased battling with themselves. He had not lied, he truly had given me a gift. I grabbed my phone and began typing a text. I erased my words once again before coming to a halt on what I intended to say. Thank you. I put a sorrowful emoji followed by a determined one. You're welcome, I replied after waiting a few minutes. I wish you a good life, Alice. I'm going to contact a lawyer regardless of the prenup. I've been really open, it's only money. And I have plenty of it. I hope you learned from all that happened. But it is not up to me to dwell on it. I will always remember you, he will always remember. There's no tenderness or anything like that. Just remember, as for me, it will take a long time before I forget about him. I moved over to the counter to pour myself another shot of vodka, hoping that someday far in the future, I'd be able to appreciate Valentine's Day again.